This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's normally what I do in this series. Sometimes I also like to take a look at the other end of the spectrum and talk about the absolute worst cards in the game, and that's what we're doing today. At this point, I've looked at the worst cards in most color pairs, but Golgari is still one that I haven't gotten around to, and that's what we're doing today. The cards that appear in this type of list and where they are ranked is based on my opinion, but I do use a little bit of data to help me make my selections. There are two things I look at when making a worst list, and if either of these things are true, the card is disqualified from being considered for the list. So if a card ever top 8'd an important Magic event, it can't make the list, and if it's widely played in EDH, it can't make the list. I use EDHREC to help me come to a conclusion about how widely played a particular card is in EDH, since they have a database of about 200,000 decks. The cards on this list are also mediocre at best and limited. While the order of the cards on this list is ultimately selected by me, the cards on the list did have to meet these specific requirements. Obviously enough, for a card to make the list, it also had to have a Golgari color identity. This means that only the black and green mana symbols appear on the card with no other colored mana symbols. A card can have a Golgari identity simply by costing black and green mana, but a card that has a green casting cost and a black activated ability also qualifies. There are 263 cards in Magic with a Golgari identity, and in this video I'll give you my 10 picks for the absolute worst. Before we get into the list though, I want to tell you about this video's special sponsor, Into the AM. I've been talking about them a fair bit lately as they've been sponsoring a few MTG Top 10s a month since July, and I'm really excited for their sponsorship because they sell great apparel, including graphic t-shirts like this one. This one is called the Nova Tee, and it has a really simple but eye-catching design that I like a lot. Right now, Into the AM's Cyber Monday sale is still going on, and it will be until December 5th. Everything in their store is marked down anywhere from 40 to 90%, and you can use my special affiliate link in the description to get an additional 10% off on top of that. The sale will be over soon, so if you're looking to buy shirts for yourself or looking to buy some gifts for the holidays, this is a great time to do it. Now, let's get started with my picks for the 10 worst Golgari cards ever. At number 10, I have Strength of Knight. I have this at number 10 because the card is bad, but if things change a little bit in Magic, it wouldn't be true anymore. Paying 4 mana to give your whole board +3/+3 is actually a pretty reasonable card, and that's what this would do if your board is filled with zombies. The problem is, there just aren't enough decent zombies in black and green for this card to ever make sense. This has been true in both Constructed and EDH, where most zombie decks are mono-black or blue-black. So this card has real potential to get off of this list if we get a couple of sets with lots of zombie tribal stuff in the Golgari color pair, and that's not insanely far-fetched. For now though, it's basically 3 mana for a +1/+1 to the whole board, which is a terrible rate. At number 9, I have Trestle Troll. It is one of the most widely played cards to make this list, and that's probably because it's also really the least bad card on the list, but I decided to be nice to Strength of Knight for the reasons I mentioned. That's not to say the Troll is good though. A 3 mana 1/4 with Defender and Reach that can regenerate for a hefty amount of mana isn't good. It's basically made to block forever, and any card that does that as its main effect isn't usually worth your while, especially because you have to effectively pay 3 mana every turn once creatures get big enough. Meanwhile, your opponent's other creatures are probably getting in for plenty of damage, and you're hindering your own board development to leave up mana to regenerate this thing, and you just don't want to do either of those. At number 8, it is Erstwhile Trooper. This starts out as a Grey Ogre, which is a pretty ugly stat line, but hey, at least it comes with some upside. You can discard a creature card to give it +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. That's not very impressive, especially because it can only be done once a turn. Of course, if you could do it more than once a turn, it would be way, way better, so it's kind of funny how big a difference a line of text can make. So, yeah, generally, with a card that lets you pump it by discarding cards, you want it to let you discard anything, so asking for creature cards in particular is a big downgrade. And sure, this can rumble as a 4/4 with trample, but it will only be attacking that way on turn 4, which isn't impressive. I know some will say that it helps you discard a thing you want to reanimate, or a creature with madness, but there are dozens, maybe even hundreds of better ways to do that. In its limited format, Golgari was a pretty bad color pair, and having the Trooper as one of the key commons for that color pair did not play an insignificant role in making that color pair worse than the others. At number 7, it is Keru Dredma, another Golgari defender, and one that I think is even worse than Trestle Troll. A 5-mana 4/4 defender is pretty bad. Defender is pretty big downside. This comes with an activated ability for 1 and a green that lets you sacrifice a creature and gain life equal to its toughness, but that's not really enough to make this card good. In its limited format, Abzan was all about high toughness, so it did sort of fit in there, but it wasn't really the toughness payoff you were looking for, and wasn't even something you played most of the time for obvious reasons. The mediocre stats and an ability that makes you give up your high toughness creatures for a pretty small payoff just isn't worth it. At number 6, it's Mortipede. 4 mana for a 4/1 is a very ugly stat line, one that means it can die to pretty much anything, and spending 4 mana on a card like that is a good way to lose a game, since your opponent can take it down in many cases for a single mana. It does come with a decent activated ability, since it can lure everything into blocking it, meaning that the rest of your board gets through, but that type of ability is notoriously situational. You can sort of use it as a removal spell to take down your opponent's best creature with 4 or less toughness, or you can use it to get your whole board through for lethal, but those situations present themselves far less often than you'd think, especially because untapping and having this still alive isn't likely to begin with, and even if you do untap, paying a total of 7 mana for a 4/1 that lures isn't going to feel like it's worth the investment 99% of the time. This is the kind of card that can win you the game in really ideal situations, but it's a bad card because those situations will almost never present themselves. At number 5, it is Stonefare Crocodile. This card isn't an interesting one, but it is a bad one. You get a well below rate 3 mana 3/2, and you can give it lifelink if you pay 2 and a black. That's way too much mana to gain a keyword, especially on a creature that starts out with such an ugly stat line. It just isn't worth paying the mana to cast this or use its ability. At number 4, it is Rite of Reaping. This is the kind of bad card that can be kind of good in some specific situations, like if your opponent has an X3 as their only blocker and you have a creature to pump, but this thing costs 6 mana and it's a sorcery, so finding situations like that is very unrealistic. Frequently, you end up paying 6 mana for a very conditional removal spell and not really being able to take advantage of the pump effect, and that's an ugly card. It's also a card that gets really bad when compared to fellow Golgari card Cankerous Thirst, which costs 2 less mana and is an instant, and can do the same exact thing as long as you pay both black and green for it. And you, of course, have to pay both black and green for Rites of Reaping in the first place, so that card isn't a downside at all by comparison. In fact, the fact it can be cast in situations where you don't have one or the other is just upside. So, yeah, Rite of Reaping is terrible, and especially in comparison to Cankerous Thirst. At number 3, it is Creekwoodghoul. A 5 mana 3/3 has to have a pretty exciting text box to overcome such an abysmal stat line, and this, well, it can exile cards from graveyards for 2 Golgari colored mana, and you gain a life. That's not really what you're hoping for. Sure, it is graveyard hate, and there are times where that's useful, but there are literally hundreds of better ways to hate on the graveyard. Either because the graveyard hate comes attached to a way more efficient creature, or because the card is far more effective at hating on the graveyard for less mana. It is especially humorous to compare this to Scavenging Ooze, which, yeah, it's a low blow because that's one of the best green creatures ever, but looking at them side by side is pretty hilarious. At number 2, I have both Wormwood Treefolk and Wormwood Dryad. The Treefolk is the older card, and also, I think, the better of the two. Wormwood Dryad was printed in Time Spiral, a set filled with callbacks to older cards, but I'm not really sure why they felt like it would be a good idea to make a callback to Wormwood Treefolk, because it's a pretty bad card, and not an especially iconic one either. And I think what they came up with in Time Spiral is actually just worse. So let's start with the Treefolk. It starts out as a 5 mana 4/4, which is bad, though at the time of its printing it wasn't quite as bad as it would be today. It can become unblockable, which is cool, but it can only become unblockable against a player with a forest or a swamp, and the cost of that unblockability is pretty steep. 2 colored mana and 2 life for an ability that is utterly useless against players without one of those lands in play is just awful. Sure, you're cracking in for 4, but only at a very significant cost. Wormwood Dryad, meanwhile, is the same thing, but has what I think is an even worse stat line, a 3 mana 3/1. It can gain those same landwalk abilities, but it does it for less mana and does 1 less damage to you. So the abilities are strictly better than on the Treefolk, but at least the Treefolk is kind of bulky. And again, that was especially true back in 1994 when the Dark came out. When Wormwood Dryad came out, a 3-mana 3/1 was horrible. Either way, these are both terrible cards, and it's pretty hilarious that they decided to include the Dryad as a callback to something that was already pretty terrible. And at number 1, I have Wood Wraith Strangler. While it isn't the card on this list that's played the least in EDH, that honor goes to Wormwood Dryad, I still think it's the worst Golgari card ever. As has been a theme on this list, the card starts with an absolutely terrible stat line. It's a 4-mana 2/2, and then it has a really unimpressive ability. It can regenerate, and it doesn't cost any mana, which is cool, but you do have to have a creature card in your graveyard to exile. And sure, if your graveyard's well stocked, it can block ground creatures indefinitely, and you don't have to leave mana up. But is blocking with a 2/2 over and over again really worth the mana to cast in the first place and giving up cards in your graveyard? It just isn't, especially because Golgari is the graveyardiest color pair around, and there are so many better things you can do with those cards in your graveyard than regenerate a terrible creature. Well, those are my picks for the absolute worst Golgari cards ever. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you want to use them as kindling for your fire this winter, you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future content, including more MTG Top 10s and a whole lot more, please subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on my MTG Top 10s, including several more worst lists, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you like what I do, consider giving back to the channel on Patreon. Thanks for watching.